Attention, attention please. Stand by for another episode of
When Humanists Attack.
Good evening. This is Chris West, the Pontificator, welcoming you to another episode of When Humanists Attack. When Humanists Attack is a 501c3 not-for-profit religious organization, and we put on this show. This evening is the 5th of November, 3 days or 2 days after the election was held, but we still don't have any real understanding of who's going to be the next president of the United States. To talk about this tonight on this Jawbone is Roger Kimmel Smith, Electoral college dropout, and Vincent Downing, a dumbfounded voter. Gentlemen, welcome. Just to make sure that we understand what moment in time we are at. Joe Biden has won, according to a number of papers and polls, he has won 263 electoral votes by one count, 259 by another, I believe.
Heard 264 if you include Arizona, which both the Associated Press and Fox News have called for Biden, or 253 without Arizona, but with Michigan and Wisconsin, which were called for him Wednesday.
So as we speak, neither has clinched or had a news organization call another state. The Trump administration has come out with quite a few statements. Stop counting, I believe, in all caps was earlier tonight from the president.
Except in Arizona, in which it was keep counting.
Right. Well, nationally, he wants them to stop counting, but the protesters in local areas are either protesting in Michigan to have them stop counting, and no, in Michigan, stop counting in Michigan and keep counting in Arizona. That's what I heard. So it's schizophrenia as always.
I don't think it's schizophrenic. They just want to do whatever they think will lead to their boy winning.
Of course.
Yeah.
Now, I have heard, I think, reports that in the case of Michigan, there were some groups that were armed groups that attempted to sort of lay siege on vote counters or board of elections. I don't have the story precisely, and I'm wondering whether that's the only report of that type. If we can go so far as to say that some of the fears we had been, raising before the election about ways this could play out and convert into an attempted coup d'etat, some of those do seem to be in early activation, but maybe they haven't advanced so far, and maybe we're going to be able to get away with them not getting too far. It may still be too soon to say.
My concern was born of the obviously incorrect, not even assumption, but hope that Trumpism would be resoundingly repudiated on election day itself. And
I even allowed myself to dream that, such would be the magnitude of this repudiation, which we might conceivably have dealt upon this ism, that its echo would last and impact so strongly that the loss would not be just one loss in one election in one cycle, but would go on cycle after cycle. Generation or two. Imagine, is that what they deserve?
At the very least. But I think that this particular ism is going to grow and deepen in its insanity. We've got how many? One QAnon believer has been elected to Congress. So we now have, I believe in Florida, we have one woman who is now elected to Congress who at least claims to believe that her Democratic colleagues are Satan-worshiping, blood-drinking pedophiles. So...
Because just the blood drinking, that's okay. Right?
Well,
I mean, if it was just some drinking of some pedophile blood, that would be fine. But they're actually doing something wrong before they get the blood. I mean, one or the other we might be able to get along with, but all those things pile
look.
on top.
I mean, this is a constituency that exists in the American electorate, so it will now be formally represented.
And it's
How,
growing.
how many of our different weirdo and radical points of view have official representatives in the United States Congress?
I believe
I don't
there's
know. I
one
don't think
atheist.
Medicare for all is particularly weirdo or radical. I don't know. How many? What are? And the question being, what are our weirdo and radical points of view?
Well, I don't know if it's too much to say that an agenda that corresponds with much of the traditional lefty agenda as articulated very well by Bernie Sanders, for example, in 2016, and by both him and Senator Warren in this year's cycle, that agenda, is in keeping with humanist principles, or could be considered a humanist political agenda. It might be that the three of us would easily agree about that, but we may be putting too much in our mouths to say so. I think I heard you saying earlier, Vincent, that you were hoping for a grand repudiation of Trumpism, and I was agreeing strongly. I feel like I wish what could have happened in this election would have been significant enough, if not to relieve us of this damaging polarization, then at least, or perhaps even better, reframing where the polls are and what they represent, so we can have a dialogue between parties that can still allow something good to be done.
From my take on what happened, the people who ended up supporting a second term for Trump are people who are living in a media bubble that does not allow them to think other ways about certain things. This gets back to critical thinking. This gets back to skepticism. It gets back to basic critical thinking skills that people are gladly and willing to give up in order to feed other needs, like the need to be a part of this winning group. And it does hurt my feelings very much that repudiation didn't happen. However, I am not surprised. Disappointed, but not surprised. How do we talk to people moving forward? How do we, if we're going to be so polarized, how do we get together and have some kind of society where every election isn't this election?
I think the key here is to point out that the vote is 50-50. There are 50% of the country that are liberals, and the conservatives have to give up their hatred for the other half of America, and vice versa. The liberals have to deal with the existence of conservatives and find that common ground.
What is the common ground? Common ground has to start with common facts. We're living with a fact deficit here. We have an entire group of people who get their news from a station that, when they are brought to court, say we're not news, we're opinion. Every time a Fox News contributor is brought to court, Hannity, his lawyers have said that, and Tucker Carlson's lawyers have said this as well. Nobody goes to listen to Tucker Carlson or to Hannity expecting to hear the truth. They're only there expecting to get their opinion on things. That's not how it plays out in reality. And the courts have been way too lenient on these people. These people are news people. They're shaping what other people think is the reality. Reintroducing and enforcing the Fairness in Reporting Act, which was done away with by Ronald Reagan. And
Fairness doctrine.
Yes, fairness doctrine. We need to reinstitute that. It's okay to have an opinion about something, but we've got to all agree on what the something is. I was speaking with my wife and son earlier, and they were talking about how the Republicans have decided that they don't have to follow any rules. There's no middle ground. When Gingrich and Norquist and other people said, we are no longer going to negotiate with these people at all. We have an agenda. Everybody gets behind us, and we're going to push that agenda as long as we have majority. And we're going to do whatever we can to stall things. If we don't, we're not going to have the ability to interact with the Republican side in opposition or in power. The rest of us are shoved over into the Democrats, where actually there are like 15 parties that in any other normal democracy would be their own party.
In a parliamentary system, you'd have
Yeah.
you'd have multiple parties, but our two-party system pushes groups into large tents. In the Republican tent, I would say, is an essential sort of consensus of the business class. They have had an explicit agenda, I would say, since the 70s and 80s, or at least one articulated clearly by Lewis Powell in that famous memo, and I think that was 1971. And much of that agenda they have now achieved. Certainly something close to dominance in the information sphere, with this alternative to the information sphere that really did have liberal qualities to it, that dominated in the late 20th century, and dominance of much of the discourse of governance and the ability to completely obstruct governance when they're not in control. But what I expect from a Joe Biden presidency, if we're going to be fortunate enough to get one launched, is I think clearly going to be some attempt at olive branch and some attempt at negotiating a bipartisan agenda of some type, some reaching out, because that's been the predicate of Biden's campaign.
I can see him saying that, but I don't understand how the Democrats can ignore the obvious, I'll even go so far as to say fact, that the Republicans are not negotiating.
It's easy enough to paint that group as a cohesive unit and paint it in opposition to a Bernie wing, a progressive movement that is filling out the rank and file of the party, but has always faced a bottleneck from the leadership. You could hear some people say they would have preferred a second Trump term to a Bernie presidency. Whether it's too strong to say that the Dem leadership exists primarily to block change from its left, to be the gatekeepers of the working class and of progressive movements and block social justice, while playing the part of being the leaders of a big tent in our two-party system.
Okay, so that they are in active collusion with the Republican establishment, the Republican leadership, and have been for some time.
I think there's an establishment in this country that operates through the two parties and is not dependent upon them.
Yes,
I think of them that they should be considered a party or one of the sub-parties, the dominant one, but they don't need either party. So there is an American ruling class, and it's largely through the corporate establishment and through the Republican establishment and through the Democratic establishment. There is a clear class agenda from looking at it from a certain angle.
The billionaire class, as Bernie calls them, bless his heart.
And I think it was to this group that Biden was speaking when he promised them in the middle of the primary campaign that nothing would fundamentally change were he to be elected.
Progressives such as myself heard that, understood what that meant, and I, for one, held my nose and voted for establishment Democrats, because any establishment Democrat is better than any establishment Republican, regardless of how counter to my interests or my values I consider that person or people to be.
Absolutely. We were staving off what seemed very clearly an authoritarian trend, or we're attempting to. We may be able to get away with avoiding some of the worst but very easily perceivable possibilities that this election presented. But I wanted to go back on the topic of the spectrum. One of the most interesting things I found going on during the campaign was the messaging of people like the Lincoln Project and the Republican voters against Trump. There appeared to be an effort going on during the general election campaign to position a really broad spectrum against a second Trump term that included a certain segment of Republican voters and Republican opinion leaders and tried to draw them into a Biden fold. They spent a lot of money and did a lot of what I consider quite strong messaging. But from what I've heard from the voting count so far, the share of GOP identified or registered voters going to 45 increased, to well above 90% in this election. So this Lincoln Project whole idea may have been a big bust.
Also, I heard that 2 or 3 million more people voted for 45 than this time around than in the last election. If that
Turnout is
that's
very
anything you've
high.
heard.
Turnout is very high on both sides. The vote on the Democratic side in the major urban centers is extremely high, higher than usual. And the analytics on that are very interesting to look at.
Looks like the polls were
Off again.
dumbfoundingly off again, telling us that as a national aggregate, as I understood it, Biden was close to 10% higher than Trump, and I didn't see that anywhere.
No, there was a interesting analysis I heard on NPR. They were talking about that they are saying they're thinking that the people who are not talking to pollsters, the people who are completely turned off of being involved at all in any kind of a poll, because it doesn't lead to anything good from their point of view, not engaging in polls at all may have skewed that. And we have a whole segment of the population who are turning off and away from what used to be the mainstream. Don't know how that's going to develop in the future, but that was what I heard, the analysis of why the polling was so far off. But this is the second election cycle that they've been that far off, presidential election cycle.
That makes enough sense to me to explain it. When you remember that the polls are off as they relate to the Orange Man, and he is fundamentally an outlaw. Many people understand that they should be ashamed to support him publicly. Many are ashamed to admit it to a pollster because there's complete moral bankruptcy as the center of the agenda. Not to mention that he has catered explicitly to people who are deeply poor, people who are very poorly educated. This is a large segment of the 69 million. You know.
One thing that struck me is, just as Vincent a second ago was saying, he has no choice but to vote for Biden because he's the Democratic candidate. Republicans too must feel the same thing. This is the Republican Party's candidate. He's imperfect. He doesn't really fit the mold of what I'd like to see, but he's the guy that the Republican Party has put up, and I got to vote for him. Which was a huge realization for me to come to. Like, oh, shit, they actually feel the same way I do.
When you're in the middle of a war, the only thing that you don't forgive your leaders for doing is losing. Everything else you can forgive. And you kind of don't care what they do as long as they're winning. So we're in a wartime.
Yeah.
Mentality.
That would
We've got a
certainly
wartime
explain
mentality.
how the majority of Americans living through it at the time thought afterwards about Harry Truman dropping the atomic bomb.
I want to just redirect this for a second and go back to the signals that we have of the impending doom that was sown during our last discussion just before the election. We were talking about needing to move to Canada, or how are we going to get all our things together?
Oh, we were strongly concerned about the possibility, the likelihood of certain lines being crossed, leading us into an attempted authoritarian coup or extra legal takeover of the government.
Right.
And some of those possibilities have in fact manifest. We did get an illegitimate victory declaration from Mr. Trump late on Tuesday or early Wednesday morning. And we have had threats of bypassing vote counts, of stopping vote counts, and of filing lawsuits, in a blatant attempt to thwart the will of the voters, et cetera, and have the election called by judicial appointees of the president and his political party. So, I don't yet know, and it may take more time for more of this reporting to get through to us, to what degree were there real threats of voter intimidation in polling sites? Did that, in fact, thwart a lot of voting from taking place? Or was that a threat that failed to materialize? To what degree did voter suppression in the various guises of the various states succeed?
I don't think there's a metric for that. I mean, other than lower turnout. My point of view during our discussion during the last Jawbone was that civil society is robust enough to deal with Donald Trump claiming victory, and strong enough to handle a couple of days or even a couple of weeks of uncertainty. And there have been legal challenges launched by the Trump team. One of those has already been thrown out by a judge, saying that they have no ground, to just go away from my court. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. But that is, even if the entire thing ended up being decisions that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court being stacked, and the stacked court supporting reinstalling Trump as the president, that would not be extrajudicial. That would be, by definition, judicial. It may be fucked up judicial, but it would not be a coup in the literal sense, which we were discussing the other day. I don't even see hints of that happening yet. It looks like most of the Republican GOP leadership is also kind of disavowing and distancing themselves from the president on some of these calls. So I haven't seen big red flags. I think maybe that overarching government that the Democrats and Republicans both serve are exerting their need for continuity. no matter what the end result is, and don't care enough about any one person or any one race. They just want everything to go back to normal so they can continue getting there. What was it, 2% the banks want? They only want 2% of everything. I've seen some incidents. There was a great one that was reported earlier where there was an irregularity in this one district in Arizona. It ended up being about 18 votes. Right. There was another one in Georgia where a woman went home sick. That was 30 votes. None of these are tens or hundreds of thousands of votes. And these are normal irregularities from all of the attorneys general. We've not heard anything credible about anything going wrong with the counts or any real challenge to the civil authorities' right to come up with these rulings on what the actual vote counts are. So we'll see if it could change.
An article that I read says that it should automatically be thrown out because there are Republicans, observers in vote counting rooms able to issue challenges. That there is no vote happening anywhere where Republicans are locked out of the room. Therefore, there is no standing to bring any of these lawsuits that Trump filed,
including a very recent report by it was on Wired, I believe, or Vice. Sorry, it was Vice, and there was a GOP operative who was in front of a counting center in Arizona, and he was screaming about how there were votes being miscounted and there were no GOP or from their side. And the reporter chased the guy down. He wouldn't give his name, chased him down and cornered him and said, give us proof. If you have proof of this, give us proof. We want to see it. And the guy dove into a van and drove away. As later, they found out who it was, and it is an operative. But he was just throwing around accusations. And the guy was saying this is a beautiful moment, right? And critical thinking and some skepticism. You're just making a claim. You can make that claim, but we need some evidence. Okay. Oh, there's the civil society stepping in and saying, well, you're just trying to create news where there is no news in order to misdirect. So that was an interesting article as well. I'm looking forward to a Democratic president. If that happens, I'm looking forward to what I have to do if there is a Republican president. I don't feel that civil society is going to fail me, though. I'm pretty confident things are going to be okay. I'm still keeping my roots here. I'm still working on renovating that house I bought, things like that. So sometimes it does cross my mind, maybe, what would I have to do with all these assets I have if I had to leave the country? But I'm not as anxious. I don't know if either of you are still as anxious as it seemed you were when we spoke last month about this.
I think at this point, it is seeming possible and maybe even probable that the Republic, as we have known it, may survive this cycle sort of by the skin of its teeth. It certainly is, in the short term, a really severe stress test for the institutions of this really rickety republic with this 200 some odd old musty old constitution and its slavery era assumptions about how power should be distributed that have resulted in what now seems to be a structural problem of minority rule, that unleveling the playing field, whatever the metaphor should be. And that is a long-term problem for us and a really serious one. Will it be possible for this country to recover from the devastation of the government this past administration has wrought, on top of the completely unaddressed climate crisis and the current pandemic? All of these really existential crises for all humans and for the long-term or even medium-term survival of the species, of course, has to be impacting our governing institutions. I think we're seeing relatively early signs, or maybe the signs aren't so early anymore. We've been talking for decades about the erosion of civic solidarity, of real civil and political rights, of real government responsiveness to public needs and demands. And it just seems to be part of a trend in which we, over the medium to long term, may be losing our civilization piece by piece.
Am I as anxious as I was at the time of the last Jawbone? I got two answers to that question. On the one hand, I understand that the billionaire class is actually calling the shots, and that both parties are in the pockets of these probably competing and shifting alliances within these groups of mega donors. So on that hand, I think, well, in a way, it doesn't matter what I do. These decisions have already been made by people whose names I'm never even going to know as to what's going to happen in such and such an election. And in support of that, we have what the government did in response to the pandemic. The only effective response to the pandemic has been trillions of dollars in quote unquote stimulus funds, approximately 80% of which went to people who didn't need it, let's just say. Mega corporations, millionaires, billionaires, cronies, all of that $500 billion that Trump and Mnuchin said they just weren't going to agree to any kind of oversight to. The $1.1 trillion that got dropped into Wall Street's pockets right after the stock market fell, right at the very beginning of all this, that nobody's even thinking about anymore. 1.1 trillion. No debate in the Senate and the House.
And it didn't make a blip.
Somehow decided right away. $1.1 trillion went into these people's pockets. And let's just say that 80% is a reasonable idea of how much of the money did not make it to Main Street, did not make it to keeping the restaurants and the small businesses and all of these organizations that are going to be shuttering and never coming back, because the people who are actually making the decisions for us, which are certainly not the voters, aren't going to be affected by any of this stuff. On the other hand, I have had a very strong intuition since the 2016 election that getting involved in this drama, this theater, this spectacle of politics in America is actually what I should do. So I have no way of reconciling that doublethink, which it seems to me to be.
We're going to hold and keep a wait and see on which level of possible coup or not coup, or just the beast feeding on our rotten souls we're going
That's
to
right.
be
Which
experiencing.
level of disaster we are facing will emerge bit by bit.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, Roger Kimmel Smith, the Electoral College dropout, and Vincent Downing, the dumbfounded voter, for our discussion tonight on the impending doom of society, depending on what happens in the next couple of days, whether that'll be an obvious impending doom or a slightly less obvious impending doom to everyone's daily life. Please, if you like what you see, like and subscribe and click the little bell so you'll get notifications when something comes out. I want to thank the crew for all their hard work. And until next time, this is Chris West from When Humanists Attack. Have a good day.
Happy doom scrolling.
That was great.
Okay.